We start with an excerpt from the New York Police Department on April year 2000. A voice record from the sheriff, saying that, according to some civilians, a swarm of moths was wreaking havoc across the city, surrounding buildings, obstructing roads, and attacking people. And here cicadas were found emitting a noise as loud as a road breaker. They identified some specimens that measured up to 40 centimeters, with strange tentacles on their body. Sometime later, another swarm was reported in another part of the state. This time, 3 people, members of a fumigation team, were injured. Even though they were wearing full hazmat suits, one of them suffered a wound in the arm. His limb had decayed, transforming into a gelatinous appendage with hair-like structures as tough as nails. On April 11, another incident occurred in a neighboring county, on a park of a residential area. Some neighbors reported strange bodies attached to the trees, and when these began to fall to the ground, they began to writhe and twist simultaneously, akin to an epileptic attack or seizure. When taking the specimens to a federal laboratory, they found out that the bodies were malformations of moths with appendages that, despite having been confidently declared as dead, were twisting and defending the main body of the sample, difficult in the autopsy. Furthermore, this was not a mere mutation, since a more thorough analysis concluded that the specimens were amalgamations of humans and some insects, and in fact, they turned out to be super-developed human dendrites, and when they made an attempt to insert the specimen into a beehive, these avoided all contact with the sample. The following is a slightly more extensive report on a cult in America that originated around 1950 on the state of Vermont. This is obviously connected to the cult in Spain that we went over in the previous video. The name of this church is, obviously, the Church of Miorohoi. This takes us back to the first English settlers on the United States, and how 2 Catholic priests from Europe came to a town to try and establish their faith. Oddly enough, their teachings included some non-orthodoxic elements of the traditional Christian doctrine, mentioning, for example, a figure above the Holy Trinity, represented as a moth. They claimed that this was God's true form, and this entity functioned as a channel between us and God. So great was the devotion of these priests, and so enthralled were their followers, that they erected obelisks and made murals depicting this entity they so much worshipped. They even went as far as replacing at times the Holy Cross for a moth. They claimed that the insect was the true form of God, and that the only way we could truly enter into communion with God was by adopting this new true form. They also used the basement of churches and sites of worship as breeding grounds for these creatures. They even kept large specimens on cages and sent some interpreters to conversate with them, for these specimens were the true manifestation of Miorohoi. Years later, it would be discovered that on Williston, the town they settled, became more secluded and insular from the other towns on the estate, with few to no people being allowed to enter or leave. It was also reported that they held prisoner everyone they considered a heretic or a spy. They locked them up and tortured them in underground dungeons under the churches. They set huge fire pits around the monolith and made rituals to worship this so-called Miorohoi. It was not until a federal intervention was needed that all these practices were put to an end. Some townfolk managed to photograph one of the last rituals performed by the priest before his arrest in 1958. These photos were kept on the Vermont Museum until recently. After much analysis and research, the experts only concluded on one thing: something supernatural took place on that town. Since then, incidents with fire took place across America and small towns related to this cult of the moth, as a sort of protest for the arrest of the priest. This is followed by a recording of the father in one of the underground tunnels where they kept prisoners. He's talking to one of the so-called heretics that's being put through a transformation ritual to help him enter into communion with Miorohoi. In other words, the priest was using the same method that the Spanish doctor was using on the people they considered infidels. The last part is a report from 1991 of how, after suspicious activity, the FBI cleaned up a farm in Vermont. It was owned by 3 men under a note signed by the father of one of them from the 1950s. The only accord was to keep a single structure intact in the middle of the cornfields. After interrogation, none of them had any idea of what happened at the time of the Church of Miorohoi. Outside of it, there were statues and the remains of a monolith of the Miorohoi cult. To summarize the next part, where they found were passages and entrances to tunnels. These lead to some sort of cult center connected to other places through many kilometers underground, after they found the presence of breeding grounds of these moths. So, to prevent them to escape and avoid overpopulation, they simply sealed the entire place with concrete. Okay, the next part of the video goes about a news report from Central Asia about some cult activity related to Sun Moth, but nothing new so far in this series, of course. But the weird is that the cult of Myorohoi is present here in this part of the world, in Mongolia of all places. If it wasn't already strange that it had roots in Spain, but this will make sense in the season 3, because the third video and the last entrance this far starts with a documentary about the real origin of this cult. It's a story of a man that was sentenced by the Huchi dynasty. The man, who was no more than a commoner, was very delusioned by the state of the world at his time. And so, through the corruption and suffering that tyrants and kings brought to the world, he found another truth, which could bring prosperity to this world. And so, that man became the first prophet of Myorohoi. He spoke up against the Huchi dynasty. For this, he was punished by the Mask of Shame. This only reinforced his connection with the deity, initiating a process in his body that quickly became a virus that infected other people who tried to make contact with him. A literal mind virus, if you want to see it that way. It continues saying that the whole region was at one time quarantined because of this infection, and after 200 years the authorities of the region finally took down the cult and arrested all the people that bore the infection. The influence of Myorohoi then took a group of fishermen of the bay that discovered an ancient plate that turned them into followers of the moth, just as the first prophet. But this time, the Huchi dynasty had to act quickly. From these fishermen came from different parts of China and could spread the disease with more effectiveness. Eventually, and after dealing with the supernatural influence of the infected creatures that Myorohoi spawned, they all were locked on a huge complex somewhere between the modern borders of Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. Unfortunately, the overcrowding and collective suffering of these individuals led to the worst recorded case of Myorohoi transmutation to ever exist, turning almost all prisoners in amalgamations half moth, half human. After the events, the few survivors scattered to distant lands to escape from the Huchi dynasty, carrying with them the now dormant infection. For they tried to forget the promise of a new era under Myorohoi's light, losing this influence when they came to Europe, when it lost all its properties as a virus. But as you've seen, the influence of the Myorohoi had only grown in the recent years. It now tells us about the effects of the virus on a normal human being. This happened on Turkey after an abnormal infection of mosquitoes on the region. Some young man was working at a pizzeria that was rapidly mutated while he was working due to a sudden exposure to heat. He was rapidly put in a cell where they made some analysis and they found out about the virus. This happened after he made an investigation of theological studies for a school project, where he became infected by the insectoid pathogen of Myorohoi. The next part is part of a documentary talking about Jacqueline David and how during his lifetime he made some paintings that depicted large insects interacting with peasants in various ways, often marked by the name of Myorohoi. This is next followed by some tales from somewhere in China that seems like an ancient encounter with a stone tablet that contained the Myorohoi virus and wiped out a whole village. So there is no much to get of this, aside of more world building of the fisherman incident. Now we have a more detailed medical report of the virus and more scientific information of what's really going on here. To put it simple, the Myorohoi virus enters the host and begins to grow around the spinal cord of the subject. There it begins to spread all across the nervous system, entering in a hatching state. Then, after some time has passed, it can change violently how the biological process of the host works, eventually turning them into moth. This process can be accelerated or rapidly triggered by exposure to high temperatures. That's exactly what happened to the man on Turkey. Now, they brought some hosts in a late stage of hatching for the observation of the effects. They used a military underground facility where they put the subjects for further observation. Weirdly enough, the hosts did not display any aggression and were mainly fixed on observing their surroundings and interacting with doors and windows. They were of course the only living things on that facility, and they did this simultaneously as if they were part of some hive mind, understandably enough. After that, the military personnel was sent to get rid of these things, and for their dismay, the virus was intact after the hosts were exterminated, entering in a dormant state until they found another specimen to infect. The samples were then taken to a redacted university where they were considered to their disposal. Now to wrap this up, we have another follow-up to the Turkey incident telling us how there was more than one incident regarding the restaurants, and it's just how the mutation process works. just like the man with the furnace and the bakery. These were obviously some sorts of nests to this creature, so there's nothing more interesting to get out of this. So that might be the last of the Mirohoi series for now. As always, I'll leave Anomal's channel in the description down below, all credits go to him. On my end, that might be it for today. I hope you liked the video, and in that case, remember to hit the like button, subscribe to help out the channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.